I might be one, let's not meet person. So I'm currently focusing on taking care of myself, getting therapy, seeing a psychiatrist, etc. Over the past few years, especially since I have had very toxic relationships, I began noticing certain behavioral patterns I've always had. These didn't really bother me before, but they've started to affect my daily life. Since I was young, I felt a bit invisible at school. I remember that even though I did well academically and I had high grades, most teachers and students wouldn't remember my name and would act surprised when the rankings came out. Many teachers would read my name among the top 3 and ask, "Who is this?" One of the first things I remember doing, which seems strange looking back now, was becoming obsessed with this girl. She was a year ahead of me, Japanese, and seemed really shy. During lunch breaks, I would spend most of my time watching her, noticing who she hung out with, etc. Over time, my interest kept growing until one day I used the lunch break to go into her classroom and look through her things, just to find her name. I managed to do it without anyone noticing. I started following her on social media out of nowhere, and she didn't even know we went to the same school. We talked for a while. I even told her I was in another class and that I was interested in her, but I never explained how I found her profile. I just said something like, "Oh, we have mutual friends." I made sure to actually have mutual friends before sending her a friend request. I remember one day, I decided, out of the blue, to tell her things about herself that I shouldn't have known because we'd never talked about them. Her address, old blogs she had, the church she attended. I started this as a way to mess with her a little, but I loved how she reacted, slightly frightened. So I kept going until she was actually a bit terrified. After that, it felt too strange to maintain any kind of friendship. I had even followed her home once before and she had noticed. At the time, it didn't seem like anything too problematic, just the kind of weird stuff that young people do. Fast forward to today, I'm older now. I have a job, live alone, and overall have a pretty stable life. But I deal with mental health issues which I didn't understand the cause or condition of until recently. I've had a few relationships, most of which didn't end well, some because of things I did, others because of things people did to me. I remember feeling a strong impulse for revenge against those who broke my heart, fantasizing about stalking them and making them feel afraid, etc. I won't go into detail about every relationship, but the person I ended up dating had serious mental health issues as well, borderline personality disorder, depression and more. She was very wealthy, so our lives were very different. She was also younger. Every now and then she would bring up the idea of opening our relationship or mention how she and her friends thought she should enjoy life more before settling down. We began a cycle of dating and breaking up. Everything started spiraling, and each time we got back together, the relationship felt more and more distorted. Eventually, we both cheated on each other, and the relationship ended for good. But for some reason, my broken mind couldn't let it go. I was so hurt by everything that had happened, and this time it was much harder to resist those impulses towards violence, stalking, and instilling fear. I seemed like a normal person at work, in the office, but in my mind, there was this voice that really wanted vengeance. At some point, it became unbearable. After work, I started hanging around places near her house, supermarkets, parks, any spot we'd gone together. I made sure that she knew that I was there or that I had been there. Doing this made me feel better, less anxious. My mind would feel at peace for a while. We never talked directly about it, nor did she confront me. Eventually, I managed to get over it and started controlling these impulses again until they disappeared. When I began treatment and started talking about all this and other issues like my lack of empathy, struggles with socialization, and mimicking emotions, I didn't really feel. I began to see just how messed up these behaviors were. Now I'm in treatment and I'm close to a diagnosis, though it's not 100% confirmed. I don't think it's helpful to share it here. If you're feeling things like this, seek help. I'm not the type of person who wants to give in to bad thoughts or impulses. I want to be a good person, despite everything. Apologies to anyone I may have hurt with my actions. Thank you for listening. I was once dragged into a violent, bloody robbery. I wasn't exactly the most popular kid in high school. I was just this average girl, not cool enough to hang out with the popular crowd, but not quirky enough to get bullied either. Honestly, if you asked most of my classmates today, they probably wouldn't even remember me. I grew up in a big city, I won't say where, but think of places like Detroit, Chicago, or Philadelphia. I grew up in a place like that. My neighborhood was this mix of faded brick buildings and concrete jungles. There was always noise, honking horns, sirens, and stuff like that. It had its own kind of charm, but sometimes it felt a little heavy, and yeah, there was definitely a fair amount of crime. Like I said, I wasn't super popular. My claim to fame was that my dad owned a junkyard with an iron shredder. It might sound a bit odd, but honestly, it was kind of fascinating. A few people wanted to come by just to watch that machine shred old washing machines and rusty bikes into tiny bits. The first time I saw it in action, I was about 10, and the noise was like thunder. I remember feeling scared watching how the metal twisted and crumpled. It was oddly beautiful in this destructive way. All the girls in school were crushing on this guy named Marco, and of course, I was too. He was a basketball star who worked out all the time. Plus, he always seemed super smart, like he had stocks figured out or something. Everyone knew he had some family problems, but he still radiated confidence. One night during a football game, he came over to talk to me. My heart literally raced. I half expected someone to pinch me to wake me up from this dream. He didn't say much though, he just said he wanted to talk to me and ask where he could find me at halftime. I said we could meet at the front entrance. At halftime, we slipped away to his car. He said he wanted to go to McDonald's. That felt so random, but I wasn't going to complain. This was my first chance to hang out with Marco, and it was starting to feel like a date. While we were driving, he suddenly pulled over and asked if he could show me something. He took out a gun. My heart dropped into my stomach. I was not ready to see that. He said, "I need you to get rid of this," and everything around me went blurry. When someone holds a gun in front of you, all rational thought vanishes. I was terrified. I didn't want to be in that situation. I couldn't really say no because he was holding a gun. My mind raced with all the things that could go wrong. It felt like the weight of the world rested on my shoulders. I didn't ask questions, I just nodded, hoping to make things better. He told me to text him later, saying, "It was nice seeing you at the game today," after I got rid of it. We went through the McDonald's drive-thru, but I didn't have any appetite. That was seriously weird. I almost felt like I was being kidnapped. In a way, I kind of was. He didn't force me to get in the car with him, but I couldn't really tell him to let me go either. In a way, it felt like I was intimidated into being in his car. He gave me the gun and dropped me off at my car in the school parking lot. We said goodbye from there. I went home and grabbed the keys to the junkyard, praying my parents wouldn't catch me. Thankfully, they were upstairs. The keys were on the fridge. It felt like I was living in some kind of bad movie. I drove to the junkyard, but then panic set in hard. What if opening the gate was too loud and someone heard me? What if an alarm went off? What if someone showed up while I was there? What if the gun got stuck in the shredder? I'd never operated that thing alone. What if I accidentally hurt myself? What if I couldn't figure out how to operate the shredder in time? What if this whole plan backfired and made everything worse? I knew this wasn't going to work out. So instead, I went back to McDonald's, ordered a large meal, and carefully slipped the gun into a bag with fries and a burger. I looked on Google Maps, found a park about 30 minutes away, and I drove there, trying to stay calm. When I got to the park, I felt strangely detached from everything around me. I tossed the McDonald's bag into a trash can. Then I sat on a bench with my heart racing while trying to think of what to say if someone asked what I was doing. If anyone had approached me that night and asked if I was okay, I would have just asked them to call an ambulance for me. I felt so guilty that I literally felt sick. I have no idea how long I spent trying to calm down, but eventually I was ready to go home. Later on, I found out Marco's sister had gotten mixed up in something truly horrific that night. She was involved in a violent robbery where she'd used a gun to threaten a store owner. The store owner had not cooperated with her and she had beaten the man's head with the gun, leaving him bloodied and dazed on the floor. Thankfully, no one was killed, but the brutality of it all felt terrifying and sad. That victim was an old man. I was caught up in something way darker than I'd ever imagined. When Marco's sister was arrested and charged, I was terrified someone would find out what I'd done and link it back to me. I felt like I was carrying around this heavy secret and I was suffocating. The thought of being questioned by the police or worse, becoming a suspect, haunted me. I saw Marco around school and made sure not to even make eye contact. Thankfully, I never heard anything more about it. When girls talk about Marco, I said just enough to pretend like everything was normal. I still visit home occasionally and have seen Marco around. He's always surrounded by friends, laughing and carefree, but we never talk. It's terrifying how easily I was intimidated into participating in something so horrific. Each time I see him, it leaves me with a chill. A man was living in my basement for months. You hear stories about people unknowingly squatting in other people's homes, but never think it would actually happen to you. Well, it happened to me. About 10 years ago, I, 31, female, was living in a 2-family house on the 2nd floor with my then toddler. For the story to make sense, I need to try and explain the layout and the backstory. My brother's close friend at the time lived on the 1st floor, and is the one who referred me to the landlord. We had private front entrances, but a shared back entrance with a staircase that ran from the basement all the way to the 2nd floor. I would frequently leave my back door unlocked because I had a habit of locking my keys in the house. The downstairs neighbor had a friend who was kind of down and out. He had a history of substance abuse but was supposedly clean at the time. He was a relatively nice guy, and my neighbor had been letting him stay on his couch for a while. The neighbor had a 4-year-old daughter, and having someone constantly sleeping on the couch without any plans of finding a permanent living situation was becoming disruptive to their everyday lives. The neighbor tells him he needs to go. It was summertime, so the friend decides he's going to sleep on the couch on our covered porch. We tell him that's not acceptable, and when we asked him to leave, we meant the property in general. It had also become abundantly clear that he was using again, and his behavior had become somewhat erratic. He was also making a lot of unsolicited advances on me, which had become increasingly uncomfortable. He wasn't happy, but it wasn't our problem. He stopped coming around, and we no longer saw him around town. Fast forward a month or two, and I noticed things going missing. Jewelry, small amounts of money left around the house, inconsequential items I had written off as lost. This house was old, with paper-thin walls. The back door in question was right next to the bathroom along one side of the shower. It also made a very distinct noise when opened. One day my car was at the mechanic, so it probably appeared that I wasn't home. I'm showering and I swear I hear the back door open. I freeze, practically stop breathing, but after a few minutes I calm down and just write it off. I'm a notorious wimp and had a history since childhood of thinking every strange noise was a potential murderer. This was a long time ago, so I don't remember the exact length of time. Possibly a few weeks. The basement was really big, and the landlord also stored stuff down there. It was very packed with some very dark corners. We rarely went down there. The landlord comes by one day and goes down to the basement. He hears a strange noise, grabs a baseball bat, and finds this man in our basement. The man pushed the landlord down, runs out of the house and down the street. We call the police, who find him hiding in a trash strand around the corner. You really can't make this stuff up. And upon further investigation, we find the basement window had been ever so slightly propped open. In a back corner behind some boxes was a nest of blankets filled with our missing items, plus some drug paraphernalia. He had also left his flip phone behind in the chaos, where we found a lot of pictures of me sleeping. This man had been high on crack, living in our basement and regularly entering my apartment, both when I wasn't home and when I was sleeping, for months. While he seemed like a nice guy, he was regularly high on hard drugs, and that really changes people. I still get chills knowing he could have done anything to me and my child, and I would never have seen it coming. The worst part is that the charges somehow got dropped and they never even consulted us. This was not even close to his first criminal offense. We didn't get any justice at all. Jason, let's not ever meet again. Creepy FedEx driver. I, 23 female, am a bartender. I have some crazy stories where I've been genuinely scared for my life, but this has got to be the worst. I'm working a double at the restaurant. Around 11 a.m, a delivery man comes in with a package that I had to sign for. He comes, I sign the package and tell him to have a good day with a smile. I continue my shift per usual. This was a Friday or Saturday. I can't remember specifically. This was either a Friday or Saturday, and later on we got very busy. The restaurant and parking lot was full. I see a lot of different people daily, plus seeing someone for the second time ever out of their uniform, you may not recognize them. But the FedEx driver comes and sits at the bar. I don't remember him from the 25-second interaction we had that morning. So I start talking to him as I do all my customers. I get him a drink, appetizer, another drink, entree, etc. Our conversation started. Him: how long have you worked here? Me: a few years. I've worked my way up. Him: how do you like it here? Just regular conversation with a bar guest. It slowly became not so regular. He asked me if I had a boyfriend. I said yes. He would change the subject and then go back, complimenting me, saying how beautiful I was every few minutes. Can I have your number? No. I don't think my boyfriend would appreciate that. Okay, what's your last name? We could just be Facebook friends. All very annoying, but still normal interactions I've had with men in this industry. But he started to become really pushy over time, pressing me for my phone number or social media. I continued to politely decline and laugh it off. He then tells me, I actually came this morning to drop off a package with FedEx. You signed for it. I came back just for you. I smile and continue with my stupid customer service. Oh yeah, I remember you. I smile and laugh it off. I even stepped in the back to vent to my manager at this point about how he was being extra pushy and uncomfortable. Flash forward about an hour, he pays his tab and leaves. I'm just glad he's gone at this point. We'll say as a guess it's about 7 p.m. when he leaves. We are still very busy and we close at 10. So we finish dinner service, customers slowly start to leave, and the restaurant is finally empty. I've been cleaning for a while and I'm finally finishing up. It's about 10:30 at this point. I'm cleaning the bar and I look up, and I see one car in the parking lot. I notice that the delivery driver from earlier is standing outside of the car, walking around it and seeming like he's cleaning the back seat out. Doors open and he is leaning in and out with a bag. As soon as I realized it was him, who had left almost 4 hours ago, my heart sank. Why was he still here? Why was he cleaning the back seat out? I freak out. My manager and I are the only people left in the restaurant at this point. It's almost 11. I run to her and tell her everything about how he came back just for me and about how he had seemingly left 4 hours ago. And I made her come from the back of the restaurant to behind the bar up front so she could see him in the parking lot. I don't know, just waiting for me. She says she's going to call the police. At this point, my boyfriend and I had an apartment literally 5 minutes away from the restaurant. I told her not to worry about it, I'll just call my boyfriend to come get me. I did just that, but my boyfriend could immediately tell something was wrong, so I gave him a quick debriefing of what was going on. He said he'd be there soon and I hung up. All I remember is my boyfriend coming into the restaurant to get me, walking me to the car through the back door and me getting home. But my boyfriend, who was very confrontational and protective, later told me that he pulled in the parking lot to see the FedEx driver sitting in the driver's seat of his car. My boyfriend walked up to his car and knocked on the window for him to roll it down. He does, and my boyfriend tells him something along the lines of, "You need to get out of here." And this is where the scariest thing happens. The dude responded to him in a different language, just mumbling and acting like he didn't speak English. My boyfriend said something like, "I know you speak English, you've been talking to my girlfriend all night, and you need to get out of here." The guy just continued to ramble in a different language until my boyfriend raised his voice and said, "You have 15 seconds before I pull you out of this car and you never leave this parking lot." For the guy to finally put the car in drive and speed off. I was on edge for weeks after this interaction and even considered switching jobs. Why was he still in the parking lot that long after close and hours after cashing out his tab? And why was he cleaning his back seat? To the creepy bar guest / delivery driver, let's never meet again. A random guy saved me from being drugged. This happened this Saturday, 2 days ago. I'm a 19-year-old freshman at uni who moved from a fairly small town to a big city. There was a guy I talked to over Tinder for around 2 weeks. He was cute and seemed nice. We had a lot in common. He even studied at the same university. He was older though. He already had a degree and was now doing postgrad. The first time we ever met, we went out to grab a coffee on Monday, exactly a week ago. We had a great time, and when he asked me if I'd like to get drinks on Saturday, I happily said yes. We met up at a local bar and talked without a moment of awkwardness for 2 hours. We really clicked. I had to go to the bathroom, and when I came back, a man was waiting for me outside the toilet. He stopped me and told me the guy sitting at my table had put something in my drink and asked me if I wanted him to call the police. I thanked him but said no, everything's fine, and went back to my table. I really liked this guy and wanted to believe that the random man was just pranking me. Still, I wasn't willing to risk it. So I told him directly what happened. I said, "I'm sorry, this sounds insane, but after I got out the bathroom, some random guy told me you put something in my drink." He laughed and said that's crazy, and we giggled at the situation together. He wasn't serious about it at all. I apologized and said I don't think he did that, not at all, but I'd be much more at peace if he chugged my drink just so I'd know the random guy was pranking me, because nothing like this has ever happened to me before. I apologized again and said the drinks are on me and I'm very sorry to make this situation awkward. He said that's absolutely not a problem, he just had to go to the bathroom first. I waited. After 15 minutes, I realized he's not coming back. I waited around for a little bit longer, and after half an hour I paid and went home. Upon getting home, I checked my Tinder and saw he deleted his account. Okay, maybe he thought I'm so insane our date made him delete the app. Still, it bothered me. I googled him and found nothing. Today, I went to the records office at my uni and asked if a person with his name was studying here. The lady working there told me that's private information she can't share. I then asked if a person with his name has ever obtained a degree from this university. She looked it up and told me that no one with his name has ever obtained a degree here. He had lied to me. He told me he did his undergraduate degree at my uni. He hasn't. Or, alternatively, he told me a fake name. I'm now sure that he had terrible intentions and did spike my drink. I was more than lucky that someone noticed. I have no idea what he'd do to me had I drank that drink, and I really don't want to know. I'm still a bit creeped out by the situation. I did delete Tinder, and I'm very glad I didn't give him my phone number or my address. He did offer to pick me up, and I cleverly said no. Dumbly told him that the coffee place we met up at is walking distance to my apartment, so he knows the area I live in, as well as my first and last name and where I study. I don't think there's anything I can do about it though. I seriously doubt he even gave me his real name. To the random Tinder guy who lied to me and probably tried to drug me, let's not meet again. And to the kind man who'd made me aware of the situation, thank you very much. A true, very creepy surveillance story. I discovered this subreddit today, which reminded me of something that happened to me in 2008. This was a huge thing to my friends and family at the time. I didn't really talk about it back then as it scared the hell out of me. I was living with my parents and sister in Brisbane, Australia. The year was 2008. My dad had just got Foxtel, a cable TV service here in Australia. But only the TV in the lounge room could use the cable box, and I really wanted to get the cable in my room without paying $99 for a new box. So one day, Dad went out and brought an AV transmitter/receiver. It was a two-piece bit of hardware where you would plug this tiny box into the cable TV in the lounge room, and it would transmit a video signal to the receiver connected to the TV in my room. So one Saturday, I decided to connect it. My younger sister was the only other person home at the time. She was upstairs in her room. Anyway, I opened the box and connected it up. At first, I was going back and forth, trying to get the channels right, etc., but no luck, until finally I got something. I remember just sitting there and something started fuzzing in, and this is where things start to feel like a horror movie. As it started fuzzing in, I remember that the cable box wasn't even on, so I wondered, why was I getting a signal? Then the picture fuzzed in, and I saw a bed. I freaked the hell out because my first thought is that it was my bed. I'd recently seen Saw 2 and remembered that scene where she turns on the TV and it's a camera filming her in her apartment. That was the first thing that I thought of. I sprinted upstairs to my sister, absolutely terrified. I told her to come down and take a look. She came down and we both realized it wasn't my bed. We didn't know whose bed it was or how I was getting the signal, but obviously it was the AV receiver picking up a camera signal. But we were just so confused as to who or what it was for. Eventually, my parents came home and we concluded that it would have to be a neighbor or someone living close by for us to be receiving the signal. We waited around until about 6 p.m. and then someone came into the room. My dad recognized it as one of our neighbors. We still didn't know what the camera was for, but we assumed it had something to do with fidelity. Either his wife or he had set it up to watch the other and see if they were cheating. Either this or it was to tape themselves doing things. We entertained the idea that he was a murderer and would film himself murdering people in his room, but just to freak each other out. We'd always make jokes about how one night we'll turn it on and it'll just be his face with clown makeup on, staring at the camera, waving, and then him walking out of the bedroom with a knife. Although this never happened, what did happen was still insanely creepy. We connected to this signal for over a week, but after a few days the novelty kind of wore off. We felt a bit weird watching it, and just resigned to the explanation that it was to catch his wife cheating, until one day we turned it on and realized what we had discovered. Our neighbors were having a bunch of renovations done to their house. During weekdays they would be out and there would be workers at the place pretty much all day. It had been like this for over a month. We started watching the feed and saw a man walk into their room. It was the plumber that had been there regularly for the renovations. We didn't think anything of it until he started opening drawers. I called out to my mum and we started watching it. He started getting the wife's underpants and sniffing them and doing all sorts of creepy things. At first we were like, oh my god, how embarrassing, he's being filmed. Will the neighbors see this somehow? But then what happened next was truly terrifying. He slowly walked over to the cameras and looked right down the lens. We were convinced that he knew we were watching. Mum immediately called Dad, but I kept watching. He started fiddling with it and then put it back down. I told Mum that I don't think he knew we were watching, but he's definitely the guy that put the camera there. Dad came home and by this time the plumber had left. Much to Mum's pleading, Dad went over to the neighbors to tell them what he saw. Mum wanted to completely stay out of it and was terrified, understandably. When we told the neighbors, they had no idea what we were talking about. They allowed Dad to go up to their room, and what he found that was holding the camera was an installed device in the wall that was designed to monitor water usage, which was completely normal at the time, as Brisbane had been hit with a drought recently and there were lots of water restrictions. The plumber had installed this into the wall, but had fitted a camera behind it in the wall to watch the bed. Immediately, they called the police, who came over and conducted an investigation. For the next week or so, we didn't hear much about it. I spent most of this time just telling my friends, but truthfully, my whole family was scared every night. It was just very creepy thinking that we could have stuff like that hidden in our house. Chances are we didn't, but it was still really scary. After a couple of weeks, my mum was speaking to the wife next door and asked what happened with it all. The wife said that the police found out he would at nights come to our street and sit in his car, which had really tinted windows, and watch them on his laptop. When Mum told me this, I got the biggest shivers, as on multiple nights when I'd driven home late from my girlfriend or walked home drunk after a night out, I remember seeing a station wagon always about 30 meters down the street from our house. It was never there during the day, always at night. I'd always walk past it and look at my reflection in the windows, assuming no one was inside. I was always so confused by whose car it was, but literally never thought it was anything. It still scares me so much that it was just this creepy plumber sitting back there on a laptop watching a hidden camera stream of my neighbors. Anyway, that's my story. It's all true, and it still creeps me out to this day. To understand my story, you sort of have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws in Australia, in that we don't have any. So long as you're respectful and non-destructive, you can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing, so long as once you leave the area, you left it how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at a time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There were always yachts bobbing just off the shore, with people in them and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this was the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in the winter of 2010. I know you love dogs and she'll be very important to the story later on, so let me tell you a little bit about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dog fighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a lurcher/staffy mix. She is a wonderfully well-tempered dog with people and most dogs, but absolutely do not threaten her, she'll have you. So by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but as far as my family are concerned, dogs go on camping trips. So when we all piled into the car, she came too. Unusually though, none of the family friends could make it, so it was only me, my sister, my dad and my mum. I didn't mind, I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog, and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we'd left a bit later, we arrived at sunset. Not a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up and the beach illuminated in campfires, but the beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car while they sat pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year and I wanted her to have air. As we're fumbling about in the dark, on a beach in the middle of nowhere, it's pretty spooky. The one road that led to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big O shape if you felt like it. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, Mum's asking him had he seen that car drive around. It's been a few times. My dad kinda shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mum said it must be the security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool, a junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches. Although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. Don't really like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this he got up immediately, holding onto the camping mallet and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here, and he was just letting us know. My dad tried to initially be a bit low-key with the guy and told him that it was fine, would leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us, so my dad started shouting and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest, I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad and possibly us as well once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she's always put dad in a relationship with him above us. But this isn't how it went down. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator. She ran from behind us and leaped and got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in the arm she had got him by. He kicked her, he punched her and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. Quickly as we could, we gathered our things and all got back in the car, all pretty shook up by the incident. I looked Palmy over, she was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I'd left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her. As it was an old car and had the rolly down windows and not an electric button, we think she must have been able to hit it with her paws to force it down enough to squeeze out. But this is not the end of my story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided just to drive home so we could all feel safe, but first had to drive into the nearest town for petrol as they were getting low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a petrol station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to get a better look and stuck his head out the window. My mum asked him what on earth he was doing, and I told her he was trying to see when it opens. My heart sank. Parked in the corner behind a van was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was remote. The next town over was 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol. We realized as we began driving, we were going to break down. That's fine, Dad said. We had AA cover. They'd come to us home or at least somewhere acceptable for the night, better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flashed from behind us. Another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him, following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us. But we were really little kids. We were both double digits. We knew how dangerous this situation was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol and the man followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fume meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home, just grateful nothing worse had happened than that. After getting some sleep, my mum phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she spoke to said they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho. As I said, they never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then? Other than crazy man on the beach, let's not meet? Well, for me, it's that I love Parmesan. I live in a small town in rural Australia. I'm a cyclist and I coordinate sports events, marathons, sell bikes and gear and whatnot. Around 6 a.m. this morning, I drove my bike up the mountain and on the way I passed a woman sitting by the side of the road. At first I thought she could have been a hitchhiker, but there's no hotels around here and she had no bags. I stopped my car about 400 meters from her, grabbed a bottle of water out of the car boot and walked down to see what was going on. This is the moment I realized she's one of the most gorgeous women I've ever seen. She was probably about 20, pale as hell with long wavy blonde hair to her hips and one of those really German kind of hourglass figures. This chick was crazy hot. She was wearing one of those long summer dresses that beach kids seem to love, which I thought was weird for being in the middle of the Australian bush. I hand her the bottle of water and ask if she's lost or needs a lift back to town. She just stares, doesn't take the water, no blinking. I think, oh shit, she's some kind of crazy. So I ask her if she ran away from somewhere and she just said no and still hadn't blinked yet. I then ask her if she's waiting for someone to come and pick her up and she said no again. I ask where her house is and she said here. I'm halfway up a mountain and there are no houses around here, so I was kind of starting to get really creeped out by this point. I walked back to my Jeep, was going to drive back down the mountain where there was a phone signal and call the cops and get them to come and sort this lady out. She just follows me and I was like, look, are you sure you don't want me to run you back to town? She just says no, again. So I say, I don't feel comfortable leaving you here in the middle of nowhere. Please just let me take you back to the police station. She just turns around and walks off into the brush, miles from anywhere. And I'm just sitting there like, what the hell? And then I really started to get scared when the bug and bird noises started to come back. It made me realize I hadn't heard a single other sound while I was talking with her. No magpies, no crickets, no early morning sounds at all. I hightailed it out of there and called the local coppers when I reached the bottom of the mountain. I told them I saw a woman up the mountain who refused to get into my car. And then I realized how messed up that sounded and hung up. I swear I hallucinated the whole thing. What the hell was that? I frequently go bushwalking in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia, and have done so since I was a kid with my dad. Sometimes for shorter walks I go alone. Yeah, that could be dangerous, and as a woman I could have added risk of being attacked or whatever, but I carry a couple of knives with me so I don't really feel threatened, and I always bring a satellite phone just in case. I just love and crave that feeling of being entirely surrounded by the bush. Anyway, around 5 years ago, I thought it would be a good idea to do an overnight walk by myself. Bad idea. The walk was fine. 3 or 4 groups of people came by the other way on the first day. I picked a little area to stay overnight towards dusk, cut a few ferns back, and I had a space to stick my little one-person tent. I was maybe 30 meters from the track, mostly out of sight behind trees and such. The usual wildlife noises were going on as I drifted to sleep, though there was a strange noise. I can only describe it as a bounding sound, like somebody was sprinting through the bush right past me, but it went by way too fast with too few steps to carry a person that distance. Also, if you've ever seen the bush in this part of Australia, you'd know there isn't much space on the ground to walk freely if you're off the track. I felt a bit uneasy, but convinced myself it's probably just stuff falling from a tree or whatever. Next morning I had brekkie and packed my things and kept going along the track. Passed a couple of people going the other way, then was alone again for maybe half an hour. Then I heard the sound of a stick being broken as if someone had stepped on it. The sound came from behind me and to my left, away from the track. I turned around to look and nearly died on my feet. A fair distance into the bush was something standing there and looking directly at me. I wanted to believe it was a person, but it wasn't. I can't judge the exact height, but it was obviously very tall, I'd guess 9 feet. Its skin was dark grey or brownish. It had a horrifically large head with huge black eyes. I couldn't see a mouth or anything. Its arms and legs were really long. I was almost crying. Tears welled up in my eyes, completely frozen, staring at this creature. It was like my legs were locked in position. The longer the stare went on between me and the creature, I had this ever-heightening feeling of absolute dread, like nothing I'd ever felt before. The fear built up, and I suddenly bolted. I sprinted away, continuing on the track. I ran and was too scared to look behind me. Tears were streaming from my eyes as I was running away. I didn't stop until I caught up with some people going the same direction as me. They looked at me and were saying, "Oh my God, are you alright?" I was tired from running so hard for so long. I told them I saw something in the bush and asked if I could walk with them for the rest of the way. It took me 6 months, but I did start bushwalking again. But I never go alone these days. You couldn't pay me to do it. For some background, I grew up involved in scouting and left around the age of 15. I've recently become involved again as a leader, and I'd forgotten about my experiences camping in rural Australia until revisiting a campsite and reminiscing on some scary stories. I figured I would share it here and potentially get some insight on what this may have been. I was about 13 or 14 at the time and had gone on a camping trip with my troop. We went to a campsite we stayed at often, as it was only around 30 minutes away from our city. It was large and open to account for many scouts, as it acted as a hub for my state's combined activities that all groups would attend. But this particular camp was only for our group, which consisted of 10 to 12 people. We set up camp in a back corner of the campsite, which was backed by a fence and thick trees, leading to a cliff overlooking a river if you walked far enough. We arrived around 6 p.m, set up camp, and basically went straight to bed. In the center of the campsite was a large toilet block surrounded by rocks and separated into 4 sections, male and female, adult and youth. Our campsite was probably about 300 or so meters from this block. The first 2 nights went without incident, but it was our 3rd night that something occurred that left myself and 2 others with a sleepless night and an apprehension to camping there ever again. It was 3 to a 10, and we all hopped into our sleeping bags for our last night before heading home. The others in the tent, Olivia and Jess, dozed off fairly quickly, but it took me a little longer. I've always struggled to fall asleep and stay asleep, so when I seemingly randomly woke not long after nodding off, it wasn't a huge shock. Nothing seemed amiss at first, so I closed my eyes to try to fall asleep once again, but it only took a few seconds for me to hear footsteps walking towards the toilet block. We were camped in an area of lush green grass that scrunched under your feet, and the sound of someone walking was distinct in the quiet night. I thought it was strange. I hadn't heard a tent zipper, but brushed it off. A few minutes later, I heard them approaching, still a normal course of events, until the footsteps stopped outside our tent. I looked over and both Olivia and Jess were sound asleep, so I knew it wasn't one of them. I waited a few seconds and they continued moving, so again I figured it was strange but brushed it off. Then sounded as though the footsteps looped around the group of tents and back to ours, the other side this time. The tents were set up in a line with a fair amount of distance between to account for guy ropes, as wind had been forecast, but on this night the wind was almost non-existent. The person or thing had seemed to walk around the whole line to stop back at ours again, which was second closest to the toilet block in a line of 4. I then heard them walk around the tree line. I sat up, trying to listen as closely as I could now. At this point, I was sure it wasn't one of us. The behavior of the footsteps was too strange, and why on earth had they sounded like they were walking into the trees? I think it was close to 2 a.m. at this point, and I'd had enough of being alone experiencing this and gently shook Olivia awake, shushing her as she stirred. Olivia was my closest friend in the group, and I whispered a quick explanation of what I heard to her. We agreed to wait a while and see if anything else happened. Quite a few minutes passed, I don't remember how many, and the weirdness of the situation had started to wear off, and I was about to suggest trying to fall back asleep when the footsteps seemed to return from where they had left off, and again stopped behind our tent. Olivia and I shared a look in the dim light the moon was casting in the tent, and I could tell she was as unsettled as I was. We heard them begin to slowly circle the tent, and she silently moved to huddle next to me. Bit by bit, the footsteps began to quicken until they seemed to break into a run. Whoever, or whatever it was, had to expertly dodge our guy ropes to move at that speed without tripping. Every now and then, something would brush the sides of the tent as Olivia and I were holding each other, doing our best not to make a noise. It was at this point that Jess woke up and asked what the hell is going on. She looked over to us, tears forming in her eyes, and shot up, terror crossing her face. She silently moved over to us to join us in our terror-filled huddle. Her question did not seem to faze whatever was making the noise. The sprinting went on for what felt like ages, but in reality it was probably only a minute or so, until they stopped in front of our tent again. I slowly reached for a spare tent peg and gripped it as tight as I could, thinking that in a pinch it would do as some kind of a weapon. The footsteps slowly did their wrap around the tents again before stopping behind ours and retreating back to the tree line. With some insane burst of courage and morbid curiosity, I decided to try and take a look outside. Still gripping my tent peg, I slowly unzipped our tent, trying to be as soundless as possible. The fly unzipped from the bottom, so I laid down and peeked underneath, rather than unzip it and then potentially create more noise. The footsteps had seemed to stop shortly after their retreat, and there were no further noises. This would mean that the person would have had to get over a wire fence without a sound, which didn't seem plausible. But I saw absolutely nothing. Needless to say, the 3 of us didn't get any more sleep that night. When recounting this story to our leaders that morning, we were told we'd probably just heard a possum or some other animal. An explanation I simply do not buy. None of the other campers had heard anything. The strangest part of this experience to me is that there were no other sounds, other than the footsteps and the occasional brushing of the tent. No heavy breathing or any spoken words or even animal noises. The person or thing seemed to disappear when I went to look. Why was our tent targeted? Had something been looking for a target, and when I awoke it chose us? Why did it just leave after scaring the ever-living daylights out of a group of teenagers? Why hadn't anyone else heard anything? Our tents were decently spaced apart for the guy rope, so it's plausible that the noise was harder to hear for other campers and maybe not enough to wake them, but the sound seemed fairly loud to us. The highway rest stop. I've driven the Great Northern Highway countless times, a long stretch of emptiness cutting through the Australian outback. It's the kind of road where you lose yourself to the monotony of red dust and endless horizon. But one night it became the place I'll never forget. I was driving back to Perth from a mining gig up north. It was late, probably around 11 p.m, and the road was dead quiet. The fuel gauge was creeping towards empty, so when I saw a flickering sign for a rest stop a few kilometers ahead, I decided to pull over. I figured I'd top up on petrol and grab a coffee to push through the final leg of the drive. The rest stop wasn't much. A single fluorescent light buzzed above the pumps, casting everything in an eerie, sickly glow. There was a convenience store with a large window, but the interior was dark. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Back in 15 minutes." I sighed, frustrated, but decided to wait. The night was too quiet, the kind of silence that feels oppressive. I leaned against my car, scrolling through my phone when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one, just the dim light of the rest stop and the dark void of the outback beyond. I shook it off, chalking it up to tiredness, and turned back to my phone. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far side of the pumps. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it cut through like a knife. I froze, my eyes scanning the area. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had started. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. No answer. Then I saw movement, a shadow, low to the ground, darting behind one of the pumps. It was quick, too quick for me to get a proper look, but it was there. I climbed back into my car, locking the doors. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably just a stray dog or some other animal. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I turned the ignition, ready to leave, but the car didn't start. It sputtered once, twice, and died. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Nothing. The tapping came back, louder this time, closer. It wasn't coming from the pumps anymore. It was coming from the window behind me. I whipped around, and that's when I saw him. A face, barely visible in the dim light. A man's face, gaunt and wild, staring at me through the back window. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his lips moving as if he were whispering something. For a moment, I was paralyzed, too terrified to move. Then I realized his hand was pressed against the glass, his fingers spread wide. As I watched, his nails scraped down the window, making a high-pitched squeal that sent shivers down my spine. "Let me in," he whispered. The sound wasn't muffled by the glass, it was inside the car, clear and sharp in my ear. I screamed, scrambling away from the window, but the man didn't move, he just kept staring, his eyes boring into mine. His mouth twisted into a grin, revealing teeth that were broken and yellow. "Let me in," he said again, louder this time. Suddenly, the car rocked violently, as if something or someone had slammed against it. The man's face disappeared from the window, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the car, fast and deliberate. I grabbed my phone and dialed 000, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The operator answered, but before I could speak, the signal cut out, just static. Then the man's face was back, this time in the driver's side window. He pressed his forehead against the glass, his breath fogging up the surface as he stared at me, unblinking. He started tapping again, this time with something metallic. I glanced down and I saw it, a long, rusty blade, the point scratching against the window. "Let me in, or I'll make you come out," he hissed. I was trapped. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I fumbled with the ignition again, praying for the car to start, but it was dead. The man's tapping then turned to banging, each blow rattling the car. And then the worst part, I looked into the rearview mirror and saw another figure, a second man, crouched in the back seat, his head tilted unnaturally, as if his neck was broken. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light and his mouth opened in a wide, silent scream. I bolted out of the car, adrenaline taking over, and ran. I didn't know where I was going, I just needed to get away. The outback stretched endlessly in every direction, but I didn't care. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, and the sound of laughter, low and guttural, echoing in the empty night. Eventually, I stumbled onto the highway, waving frantically at an approaching truck. The driver stopped, pulling me into the cab, and I broke down, sobbing and babbling about the men at the rest stop. When the police arrived, my car was gone. There were no signs of anyone, just deep scratches on the asphalt near where I'd parked. The officer who took my statement listened quietly, his face impassive, but his eyes betrayed something else, something he wasn't saying. "You're not the first," he admitted after a long pause. "The rest stop's been trouble for years. People go missing, cars are found stripped and dumped miles away, but we've never caught anyone. It's like they just vanish." I tried to ask more, but his radio crackled to life, summoning him back to the station. Before he left, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Stay off these roads at night," he said. "And if you see a rest stop like that again, keep driving. No matter how tired you are, just keep driving." The truck driver who had picked me up gave me a ride to the nearest town. As I stepped out of the cab, he handed me my backpack, the one I thought I'd left in the car. "You dropped this," he said, his brow furrowed. I hadn't dropped it. It had been in the back seat, zipped shut when I fled the car. I opened it cautiously, my blood turning cold. Inside was a single item, a broken, rusted blade, smeared with dirt and something darker. A crumpled scrap of paper was wrapped around the handle. "We'll find you," it said. The truck driver swore he didn't put it there. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the motel walls, every distant shuffle set my nerves on edge. I forced myself to move on the next day, pushing the experience to the back of my mind, trying to convince myself it was over. But was it? Because sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the soft, rhythmic tapping on my windows and on my door, and I can't help but wonder Did I ever really get away, or are they just waiting for the right time to finish what they started? In the vast, empty expanse of the Australian outback, a place where the land seems to stretch forever. It's a place where the sun burns hot during the day and the cold creeps in once it sets. But the most chilling part of the outback isn't the heat or the cold, it's the silence. At least it was silent, until we heard the whistling. I was with a group of friends, roughing it out in the desert for a few days of camping. No roads for miles, no phones, just the open sky, red earth, and the stars above. We set up camp near an old dry creek bed, surrounded by grass and scattered rocks. A place as desolate as it was beautiful, the perfect spot to get away from it all. The fire cracked as we sat around, beers in hands, trading stories of our travels. Everything seemed peaceful at first. The only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind or a distant animal call. But as the night wore on, my friend Ben, who had been strangely quiet all evening, suddenly sat up. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The others fell silent, listening. There was nothing at first, just the soft snap of the fire and the buzz of the crickets. But then, faintly, we heard it, a soft, high-pitched whistle that seemed to come from somewhere far in the distance. The sound was strange, unnatural, like the wind itself was trying to mimic a human tune. It was slow at first, almost like a warning. "Probably just the wind," said Sarah, shrugging and leaning back in her arms. But Ben wasn't convinced. He stared into the dark, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't know. It's not normal," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He had been to the outback before, and he knew how dangerous it could be to ignore strange noises, especially at night. The whistling grew louder. It was as if it was getting closer with every passing moment, but no one saw anything. Not a shadow, not a figure, just the moonlight reflecting off the dry, cracked earth. Then all at once, the wind picked up. The fire flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the camp. And there, among the sound of the howling wind, the whistling stopped. "That's weird," my friend Sarah muttered, uneasy now. That didn't sound like the wind anymore. Before anyone could respond, Ben stood up, his face pale. "It's not the wind," he said, voice shaking. "It's following us." We looked at him, confused. Then, one by one, we heard it again. A whistle, sharp and clear. Right behind us, it sounded like it was coming from just beyond the firelight. The kind of whistle someone might make if they were trying to get your attention. Panic set in. We grabbed our torches and shone them into the darkness, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement, just the cold, empty vastness of the outback. The whistling came again, closer now. So close that it almost felt like someone was standing right behind us, just out of sight. Someone or something. Ben backed away from the fire, his eyes wide with terror. "Over there," he whispered. "I think I see something." Had someone been stalking our camp, watching us and whistling? I asked. "There's no way," said Sarah. "That's insane." But at that moment, the whistle came again, louder and more insistent. Without thinking, we grabbed our things, ready to leave. But as we stood up, the whistling stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was as if the entire world had paused. Then, through the quiet, we heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the dirt. Slow, deliberate steps, and then a voice.
"G'day."
We turned to face the figure standing just outside the firelight. A man, tall and thin, with sunken eyes and a crooked smile. His clothes were tattered like he'd been wandering the outback for decades. The man took another step closer. "You shouldn't be out here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind.
"The outback takes what it wants, you know. It always takes."
No way we were going to stay and find out what he meant by that, so we ran. We ran like we'd never ran before, through the dirt and the scrub until the first light of dawn broke across the horizon. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, we looked around. No sign of the man, no sign of anything, just the quiet, empty outback. We got back to our car and vowed never to return. I hope to God that I never hear that creepy whistle ever again. When Jess suggested we camp near Wolf Creek Crater, I hesitated. Everyone had heard the stories, the notorious murders in the early 2000s that put this remote stretch in the Kimberley on the map for all the wrong reasons. Mick Taylor, the serial killer immortalized in a film, had stalked travelers here. Though the movie exaggerated details, the real-life events were terrifying enough. Young people disappearing without a trace, their fates revealed only by scattered belongings and chilling witness accounts. Jess shrugged off my unease. That was years ago. It's just a crater now, nothing else. Besides, the stargazing there is incredible. I should have trusted my instincts. We arrived in the late afternoon. Me, Jess, Ethan, Sarah, and Mark. The crater was as eerie as it was beautiful. A massive gouge in the earth surrounded by endless, barren bushland. The air hung heavy with the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath. "This place is spooky," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's the charm," Jess said, snapping photos. "Embrace it." We set up camp on a flat patch of land just a short hike from the crater's edge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the outback transformed into an ocean of darkness. The stars were breathtaking, but the vast, open emptiness around us was suffocating. We lit a fire and tried to lighten the mood with jokes and stories, but the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing hour. It started just after midnight. A whistle. Not the kind made by wind, but deliberate, a single high-pitched note that cut through the stillness. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, clutching her jacket. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said, though his voice betrayed him. There was no wind. The whistle came again, this time closer, followed by a faint crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. "Okay, not funny," Jess said, standing up and shining a flashlight towards the sound. The beam landed on nothing but bushes and scrub. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves it was an animal or our imaginations, but then came the laugh, a deep, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo all around us. Mark stood, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello? Who's out there?" No answer, just another crunch of footsteps, deliberate and heavy, circling the camp. We huddled closer to the fire, its flickering light casting long, jagged shadows. Every sound made me jump. Every whisper of the night felt like it was closing in on us, then Jess screams. Her flashlight had caught something, a figure half hidden behind a tree. He didn't flinch at the light, but stepped out, fully into view. He was tall and wiry, his face gaunt and leathery, as if it had been baked by the sun for decades. His eyes were what froze me. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with something that was neither curiosity nor malice, but the kind of cold calculation that made my stomach churn. "Hey," Mark shouted, brandishing a stick from the fire. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer. He just tilted his head, studying us like we were animals in a cage. Then we saw the others. Two more figures emerged from the darkness, standing at the edge of the firelight. One was clutching a rusted axe, the other dragging a length of chain that scraped against the ground. Faces were slack, emotionless, as if they'd done this before and knew exactly how it would play out. "Get in the car," I yelled, grabbing Sarah by the arms. We bolted, our gear forgotten. Mark swung the fiery stick wildly as he backed towards the vehicle, keeping the figures at bay. Jess fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling as the others began to move, slow and deliberate, their footsteps crunching on the dry ground. "Jess, hurry," Ethan shouted. The car roared to life and we piled in, slamming the doors just as one of the men reached out, his dirty, calloused hand smearing the window. As we sped off, the headlights illuminated their faces one last time. They weren't shouting or chasing us, they just stood there, watching, the faintest hint of smiles tugging at their cracked lips. We didn't stop until we reached a roadhouse hours later. The police listened to our story, their faces growing grim. "This isn't the first report we've had out there," one officer said. "A few other campers mentioned men like that, but we haven't been able to find them," and he hesitated, his expression darkening. "There's been a string of disappearances in the area. Travelers who set up camp and were never seen again." When the officer asked where we'd camped, my stomach dropped. "By the crater," I said. He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. One group went missing from the same spot last month. We only found their car, blood in the back seat, nothing else. We never went back to Wolf Creek, but the memory of these faces, these cold, calculating eyes haunts me. They let us go that night. I don't know why, but I can feel it in my bones. It wasn't mercy, it was a warning. The outback stretches forever. Endless plains of red dust, shimmering heat, and scrubby bushes that seem alive only because they sway in the wind. I'd always wanted to see it for myself, to feel the isolation, the silence. I thought it would be beautiful. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. It started as a road trip, just me, my boyfriend Jake, and his sister Tara. We rented a 4-wheel drive and packed it full of supplies. Our plan was simple: drive from Alice Springs to the Gulf of Carpentaria, taking our time to explore the most remote parts of the country. It was the third night when things went wrong. We had set up camp near an old windmill, miles from the nearest town. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the outback transformed. Shadows grew long, the air chilled, and the vast openness that had seemed liberating during the day now felt suffocating. As we sat around the fire, Jake started telling stories about people who had vanished in the outback: backpackers, hikers, travelers. Some were accidents, dehydration, heat stroke, but others, the stories were darker. Groups who had gone missing without a trace, campers whose sites were found abandoned, belongings untouched. Some say there are people out here, Jake said, his voice low, who've gone feral, living off the land, hiding from the law, watching anyone who comes too close to their territory. That's enough, Tara snapped, throwing a stick into the fire. It's just stories. Tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The night was too quiet, not even the crickets dared to make a sound. Later, as I lay in the tent, I heard it, a faint rustling outside. Jake? I whispered. Shh, he said, already awake beside me. His body was tense, listening. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by the soft crunch of footsteps. They circled the tent, slow and deliberate. An animal? Tara whispered from the other tent. No animal walks like that, Jake muttered. Then came the whispering, low, guttural murmurs just outside the thin nylon walls of our tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give us away. Jake reached for the flashlight, but I grabbed his arm. No, I mouthed. The footsteps stopped for a moment. There was only silence. Then the whispering turned into laughter, quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't joyful or even mocking. It was broken, wrong, as if whoever was laughing didn't know how to do it properly. The fire outside crackled and shadows danced across the tent. I saw them, shapes, tall and hunched, their outlines flickering against the tent walls. One of them leaned closer, and I held my breath as a filthy, calloused hand pressed against the fabric, tracing the curve of my face. I wanted to scream, but Jake clamped his hand over my mouth. The whispers faded and the footsteps moved away. When we finally dared to look, the fire was out. The chairs were overturned and our supplies were scattered across the campsite, but they weren't gone. The tracks led in a wide circle around us, looping back to the edge of the scrub. They were toying with us, letting us know they could come back at any time. Pack up, Jake hissed. We threw everything into the car, not caring what we left behind. As we sped off into the night, the headlights caught movement. Figures slipping between the trees, their faces pale and hollow. We drove for hours, too terrified to stop. But the outback doesn't care about your fear. It stretches on, and the darkness feels infinite. When the sun finally rose, we found ourselves on a narrow dirt road that wasn't on the map. The car was running low on fuel and every direction looked the same. Red earth and endless sky. Do you hear that? Tara asked suddenly. At first I didn't, then I did. The sound of an engine. Relief flooded through me. Someone else was out here. We flagged them down, waving our arms frantically. The truck that pulled up was ancient, its paint chipped and rusted. The man driving it had a face like old leather, his eyes hidden under a wide-brimmed hat. Car trouble? He asked, his voice thick with an accent I couldn't place. No, Jake hesitated. We need directions. The man grinned, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect. Not many people out this way, he said. You're lucky I found you. There was something in his tone, something that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Thanks, Jake said quickly, pulling me back towards the car. We'll figure it out. The man didn't argue. He just sat there, watching us as we drove away. Half an hour later, the engine sputtered and died. We were stranded. Behind us, in the distance, a plume of dust rose on the horizon. Another vehicle. Do you think it's him? Tara asked, her voice shaking. Jake didn't answer. As the dusk grew closer, I realized it wasn't just one car. There were two, maybe three. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. I don't remember running, but we did, into the endless scrub, the sound of engines roaring behind us. The last thing I saw before we disappeared into the bush was the first truck pulling up beside our abandoned car. The man stepped out, his wide-brim hat tilted against the sun, and he wasn't alone. There were others, climbing out of their vehicles. They didn't chase us, they didn't need to. They knew the outback better than we ever could. Their eyes, dark, hollow, watching us with an unsettling patience, told me everything. They knew the land, the terrain, the way the sun would burn you alive if you didn't stay on the path. They didn't need to chase us because they knew we'd break long before they did. I don't know how long we ran, long enough for the sun to blister my skin, for my legs to give out, for my breath to come in desperate, ragged gasps. But no matter how much I pushed myself, no matter how hard I tried to outrun the horror of what was happening, the distance between us and them never seemed to grow. I couldn't hear the engines anymore, but I could hear them, footsteps, too light, too deliberate, echoing through the scrub, just on the edge of hearing. Always just behind us, then everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I came to, I was on the ground, the red dust of the outback clinging to my skin. My mouth was dry, cracked, and my body ached like I'd been hit by a truck. Barely move, but I could hear Jake's voice, weak and hoarse, calling my name. Tara was shaking me, her voice frantic as she tried to help me sit up. We'd made it, we were alive, but we were far from safe. Jake and Tara had managed to find shelter in a narrow, shallow cave, hidden from view by the dense brush and boulders. I had no idea how they'd gotten there, but we weren't alone. The others, those men from the vehicles, hadn't followed us into the cave, but they were close, very close. I could feel it, their presence pressed against the air, suffocating like a bad dream I couldn't wake from. Are they gone? I whispered, my voice barely audible. I don't know, Jake said, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. We have to stay quiet, they're out there. We huddled together in the dark, listening to the sounds of the outback around us, the wind, the distant calls of birds, the occasional crunch of dry grass or footsteps. But we knew it wasn't the wilderness making these sounds anymore. For what felt like hours, we lay in the dark, barely breathing, waiting for something, anything to change. I wanted to move, to run again. But my legs were like jelly, and every time I tried to stand, a wave of dizziness hit me hard. Then we heard it, a voice, low and gravelly, calling out in the distance just outside the cave. I know you're in there, the voice said. Come out and we'll make this easy for you. I froze. Tara let out a quiet sob. Jake put his hand over her mouth to silence her. The voice called again, more impatient this time. There's no use hiding. You're out of water. You're out of food. You'll die out here if you don't come with us. The seconds dragged by like hours. The pressure in the air felt thick, like we were being watched by unseen eyes. But then, just as suddenly, the voice stopped. The footsteps faded. We stayed in the cave for what felt like an eternity, not daring to make a sound. When the sun dipped low on the horizon, we finally dared to move. Jake let us out cautiously, his eyes scanning the scrub in every direction. We had to move fast, no time to think. Our car, our only chance of escape, was miles away, but we didn't have a choice. We stumbled through the dark for hours, relying on the little energy we had left, following a barely there trail that Jake claimed he'd remembered from earlier. Every step felt like a risk, but there was no turning back. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the sky, we were at the outskirts of a small, rundown roadhouse, a place that barely showed up on the map. The lights were dim and the building looked deserted, but we ran toward it, frantic. We banged on the door and a man finally answered. He was older, with a weathered face and the look of someone who'd spent way too many years in the outback. When he saw us, his eyes widened. Jesus Christ, what the bloody hell is this? He said, looking behind us. We didn't have time to explain. Please, you've got to help us, I begged, trying to catch my breath. There are people out there, they're chasing us. We don't know who they are. He didn't ask any more questions. He let us in, locked the door, and told us to sit tight. It wasn't until we finally got a chance to rest, to drink water and breathe again, that we learned what had happened. The police had been called to the area after the authorities started piecing together missing person reports and strange sightings in the region. Apparently, the people we'd encountered weren't just crazy. They were part of a notorious group that had been terrorizing campers for years. People who had learned how to survive off the land, that had turned their isolation into something far darker. The police arrived hours later and searched the area. They found our abandoned car, but the vehicles that had been chasing us were gone, just like the people. But what haunted me the most was what the roadhouse owner said as we left. "Be careful out there," he warned. "There's a reason people don't go off the beaten path in these parts anymore." I'll never know if these people we ran from were ever caught. I'll never forget the way they watched us, the way they knew we were never getting out without their permission. I haven't been back to the Outback since, and I don't think I ever will. I'll never forget that night. It's been years, but the memory sticks with me, raw and vivid. I was house sitting for a family friend, Julie, who lived in a quiet town on the outskirts of Melbourne. She was off visiting relatives, and I had the place to myself, a sprawling, single-story house surrounded by gum trees. It was a simple gig: feed her dog, water the plants, and lock up at night. Easy, or so I thought. The first couple of nights were uneventful. My dog, an aging cattle dog named Rusty, was calm, and I spent my evenings watching TV or scrolling on my phone. But on the third night, things took a turn. I was in the living room, half watching a crime show, when Rusty started growling low in his throat. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe a possum had scurried across the roof, but then he stood up, his ears pinned back and his growl deepened. "What is it, boy?" I asked, feeling a prickle of unease. He trotted to the sliding glass door that led to the backyard and stared into the darkness, his hackles raised. I grabbed a torch from the kitchen and hesitated before stepping out onto the deck. The backyard was silent, the trees casting long shadows under the moonlight. I swept the beam of light across the yard. Nothing. "See? Nothing there," I said aloud, more to comfort myself than Rusty. But he didn't relax. Instead, he barked sharply, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the yard where the shadows were darkest. I stepped back inside and locked the door, double-checking the latch. Something felt off. The air was heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. An hour later, I decided to call it a night. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tight, and climbed into bed. Rusty followed, curling up on the floor beside me. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a strange noise, a faint scraping like metal against the glass. My heart jumped and I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone, my heart hammering, and dialed Julie's number. No answer, I cursed under my breath, and switched to the flashlight on my phone, creeping down the hallway. Rusty followed, close behind, his growl low and steady. When I reached the living room, the noise stopped. The sliding door was locked just as I'd left it, but then I saw it, smudges on the glass, fingerprints. My blood ran cold as I realized they were on the inside of the door. Before I could process what was happening, Rusty lunged towards the hallway, barking furiously. I turned just in time to see a shadow dart past the kitchen. Someone was in the house. My flashlight beam trembled as I turned towards the kitchen where I'd seen the shadow. The house was suffocatingly silent now, save for Rusty's growl. Someone was in here with us. I forced myself to move, stepping backwards towards the front door. My phone was still in my hand, but my shaking fingers couldn't manage to dial for help. As I reached for the doorknob, I froze. From the corner of my eye, I saw him. A man stood at the end of the hallway, half hidden in shadow. His face was pale and blurred, features smudged, too soft, too wrong. His body was still, but his head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if trying to study me. His eyes were the worst part, wide, black, and shining with something inhuman. My breath hitched as I realized he wasn't standing. He was swaying almost imperceptibly like a cobra ready to strike. Rusty lunged forward, barking wildly, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he raised one finger to his lips, shushing me. His lips curled into a smile that stretched too far. I yanked the door open and bolted, dragging Rusty with me. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for air. When the police arrived, I was trembling so hard I could barely get the words out. They swept through the house but found nothing, no sign of forced entry, no man, no explanation. But as they were leaving, one officer hesitated. He glanced at me, his face pale. "Are you sure you didn't touch anything in the hallway?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, why?" He didn't answer. He just motioned for me to follow him back inside. My stomach twisted as I stepped into the hallway where I'd seen the man. The walls were covered in smudges and handprints, long, thin fingers smeared as though they'd been dragged down the surface. But the worst part wasn't the handprints, it was the message scrawled between them, written in something dark and wet. I like your dog. I left that night and never went back. Julie sold the house a month later. She told me she couldn't sleep there anymore. The new owners didn't last long either. Not even 6 weeks later, the house went back on the market. I don't know what they experienced, but if it was anything like that night, I can't blame them for leaving. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that house, about the smudged handprints, the unnatural sway of the figure, and the message on the wall. I wonder if it's still standing there, hidden among the gum trees, waiting for its next occupants. But what unsettles me the most about this is every now and then, when I'm alone in my own home, I feel it again. That suffocating silence, the prickle of eyes on the back of my neck. And when Rusty, now older and slower, suddenly growls at the empty doorway, I can't help but wonder if I ever really left that house behind, or if something from that night followed me home. I'd always loved visiting my cousin Emily in her old Queenslander house just outside of Brisbane. Its wide verandas and creaky wooden floors had a charm that reminded me of childhood. But after that weekend, I can never think about that house the same way again. Emily had just moved in and was thrilled to show off the place. It's got so much history, she said, leading me through the high-ceilinged rooms. I admired the old fireplaces and stained glass windows, but something about the house felt off. Maybe it was the way the floorboards groaned underfoot, or how the wind seemed to whistle through the walls, making it sound alive. That first night, Emily and I sat on the veranda, drinking wine and catching up. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak or groan. Normal sounds for a place its age. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something strange. Every now and then, there'd be a faint tapping noise coming from below us. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch or maybe an animal under the house. But the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, deliberate. Emily laughed it off when I pointed it out. "It's probably a possum or something," she said, pouring another glass of wine. But that night, lying in the guest room, I couldn't shake the sound. The tapping was steady now and closer. I told myself it was nothing, pulling the covers tighter and trying to sleep. The next morning over breakfast, I brought it up again. Emily admitted she'd heard it too. "Honestly, it's probably just the house settling," she said, though she didn't look convinced. We decided to check it out, heading under the house where the crawl space was. The ground was damp and smelled of earth, and the dim light barely penetrated the maze of wooden beams and cobwebs. "See?" Emily said, shining a torch around. "Nothing down here." But as she turned to leave, I noticed something, a pile of what looked like rags stuffed into a far corner. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I crouched closer, the smell growing stronger, and froze. It wasn't rags, it was a makeshift bed, surrounded by discarded food wrappers and a rusted tin can. Someone had been living here. Emily's torchlight wavered as she realized what I was looking at. Her face paled and she whispered, "Let's go." We scrambled back upstairs, locking the door that led to the crawl space behind us. I suggested calling the police immediately, but Emily hesitated. "It's probably just some drifter," she said, trying to sound confident. "They're probably long gone by now." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't push her. Instead, we double-checked every window and door in the house before sitting on the couch, trying to shake the unease. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from below. I got up and went to Emily's room, whispering her name. She was awake too, her face illuminated by her phone's glow. "You hear it?" she asked. We crept to the living room together, ears straining. The tapping grew louder, then stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence. Then came a sound that chilled me to my core. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not outside, inside. We stared at each other, eyes panicked and full of fear. Emily grabbed a kitchen knife, her hands shaking. We followed the sound to the back of the house, where the door to the crawl space was slightly ajar. "I locked that," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. We stared at the door, the darkness beyond it yawning like a void. I felt something watching us, a presence so heavy it made my chest tighten. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen. We both screamed, spinning around. The fridge door was wide open, its contents scattered across the floor. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. My eyes darted frantically around the room, scanning every shadow, every corner, straining to catch any sign of movement. The air felt thick, pressing in on me, and the faint hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed deafening in the silence. That was it. I grabbed Emily's arm. We're calling the police. We locked ourselves in the bathroom, dialing with trembling hands. The operator's voice was calm, but I could barely speak as I tried to explain. When the police arrived, they searched the house and the crawl space, but no one was there, no sign of forced entry. But when they returned to the crawl space, they found something we hadn't noticed before. There was a tunnel, narrow and crudely dug, leading deeper into the ground, hidden behind the makeshift bed. The officer who came back to speak with us looked shaken. He handed over an evidence bag containing an old, beat-up notebook. Inside were crude drawings and lists scrawled in shaky handwriting. One page had a list of dates. The most recent date was that night. Next to it, scrawled in jagged, uneven handwriting, were the words, "She's perfect." Emily moved out the very next day, but leaving the house didn't mean leaving the terror behind. A week later, she called me, her voice trembling and choked with tears. "I think he's still watching me," she whispered. "Last night, I heard a tapping at my bedroom window, soft like fingernails, and this morning, there was a footprint in the garden bed beneath it, just one, but it wasn't mine." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I tried to reassure her, but deep down I felt it too, that sickening certainty that this wasn't over. Now, every creak of floorboards, every shadow stretching across my walls, makes my heart race. I can't stop thinking about that crawl space, about the notebook, about the tunnel hidden beneath the house. How long had he been there, silently observing us? And worse, what if he isn't done? Somewhere out there, the man from the crawl space is still free, watching, waiting, choosing. Sometimes late at night, I swear, I hear it, the faint, rhythmic tapping. I tell myself it's just the wind, but deep down, I know. The farm was supposed to be my sanctuary for the weekend. My parents had left for a wedding in town, leaving me to look after the animals and the property. I wasn't worried. It was remote, peaceful, surrounded by miles of dry bushland. Nothing ever happened out here, at least that's what I thought. It was just before dusk when I noticed them. 3 figures stood at the far edge of the paddock near the old gum trees, their silhouettes sharp against the burning red sky. They weren't moving, not even shifting their weight, just standing there, watching. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were neighbors from a distant property or hikers who'd wandered onto our land. But something about their stillness, unnatural, almost predatory, set my teeth on edge. I grabbed my phone to call Dad, but of course there was no signal. Out here, the bars were as fickle as the wind. The sun dipped lower, and the figures were swallowed by the oncoming night. I told myself they were gone, but I couldn't stop pacing, checking the locks on every door and window. The house felt too big, too exposed. Every creak of the old wooden boards made me jump. Then the footsteps started, soft at first, crunching the gravel outside, circling the house. I froze by the window, my breath shallow, ears straining. Then the footsteps stopped, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then a light tapping on the kitchen window. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it, but then it came again, harder this time, deliberate and unhurried. My legs felt like lead as I crept towards the kitchen, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. The window was empty, reflecting only the dim glow of the interior light. I stood there, holding my breath, when suddenly a face slammed against the glass, pale, expressionless, eyes locked into mine. I screamed, stumbling backwards. The face disappeared, and with it came laughter, low, guttural, and scattered, like they were enjoying the game. Shaking, I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the counter and backed into the living room, heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. I peeked through the curtains and my blood turned to ice. They were back, 3 of them standing just beyond the porch, their faces hidden in the shadows. One raised a hand, slow and deliberate, and waved. Then the power went out. The house plunged into darkness and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. I fumbled for my phone, its weak light casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Boots scraped against the wooden porch, followed by a knock on the front door, soft, almost polite. "Let us in," a voice called, sing-song and sickly sweet. I backed away, gripping the knife so tightly my fingers ached. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, rattling the door in its frame. Then came more voices circling the house. "She's in there," one of them said, almost a whisper. "We can wait," another replied, the words dripping with amusement. I ran to my room, locking the door behind me and shoving my dresser against it. My hands trembled as I crawled into the old chest in the corner, pulling the lid down until only a sliver of air remained. The banging stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. My ears strained, desperate to hear where they were, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then came the sound of shattering glass. They were inside. The footsteps were slow and heavy, echoing throughout the house. They weren't searching, they were savoring it. "She's close," one of them muttered, and I bit down on my lip so hard I tasted blood. The footsteps reached my room. The door creaked as they pushed it open, the dresser scraping across the floor. I clutched the knife in my sweaty hands, barely breathing. They were in the room now, their boots thudding against the floorboards, pausing just feet from the chest. The lid shifted slightly and I squeezed my eyes shut. Then the sound of a car engine shattered the tension, rumbling faintly from the distance. The footsteps then retreated and I heard the front door slam. I stayed in the chest, trembling and choking back sobs until the headlights of my parents' car spilled through the window. When they found me, I was too shaken to explain everything. The police came, but the intruders were gone, leaving no trace except the shattered window and muddy footprints on the porch. But it didn't end there. 2 days later, the local police called my dad back. They'd been investigating a series of break-ins in the next town over, ones that weren't about theft. Instead, they seemed focused on terrorizing whoever was home, women specifically. "Matches a pattern," the officer said. "Group of 3, they break in, mess with their heads, leave before we can catch them." They linked it to a local urban legend, a group of thrill-seekers who roamed rural areas looking for victims to toy with. The rumors had started after a woman went missing years ago, only for her body to be found weeks later on a property not far from ours. A week after I left the farm, my dad found something in the shed. Hidden beneath an old tarp were ropes, duct tape, and a hunting knife. On the wall above it, scrawled in ash, were the words, "Next time, no games." I can't shake the feeling that they'll come back someday, not for the farm, but for me.